So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this panel on media coverage and public perceptions of refugees and migrants. My name is Scott Griffin. I'm from the International Press Institute. Together with UNESCO, we organized this panel, this very important and very timely panel, and I want to thank all of the panelists for being here today and sharing their experience and expertise. And without further ado, I want to hand it over to our moderator today, Joyce Barnathan, who is the president of the International Center for Journalists. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, UNESCO and IPI, for making this happen. Welcome to a really important session on the coverage of refugees and migrants. I'd probably say no matter where you live, immigration and the migration of large numbers of people is kind of universal, and it's also an extremely complex issue. And in an era when this matter can be at the heart of a presidential election, we journalists have to get the story right. It's all too easy for certain government officials or the backers of fake news to take advantage of the refugee situation, stoking public fears and confusion. The cost of getting it wrong is tremendous. Our audiences, too, are often resentful of migrants or refugees and not even receptive to quality coverage when we provide it. I just want to share with you a personal anecdote. When the Syrian refugees started going in large numbers to Germany, a woman from Germany, a knitter, put out a call to all knitters around the world to knit hats and scarves for the refugees who were not used to a cold winter. Now, my daughter is a knitter, and she's not 10 years old, she's in her 20s, but she took this to heart and she started knitting hats for the Syrian refugees in Germany. And she made many, many hats and many, many scarves and sent them to Germany. And that winter, the woman posted on a site a few photos, and there was a photo of a Syrian boy wearing the hat my daughter made. So she told that story to my sister, who is a TV news producer, and she did a piece, which you can look up, that says, "New York City woman knits hat scarves for Syrians overseas." And it was a lovely little broadcast piece that aired during the holiday season about, I guess, more than a year ago. It was a truly sweet story, and it was designed to evoke holiday cheer and goodwill. The trouble was the reaction by a lot of people was just awful. I'm going to read you some of the comments on this story. "How about knitting some scarves and hats for our homeless veterans that do not get taken care of? I could care less about the Syrian refugees." Mind you, this is a story that ran in New York State. We're not talking about a deeply conservative area, though New York has its deeply conservative areas. "Wow, perhaps you should send those same scarves to the soldiers, sailors, and Marines protecting her freedom. It's chilly in Afghanistan." "How about our elderly people here, our veterans, our homeless children or children in shelters for Christmas gifts? You and other knitters could have done great things for our American people and veterans." And, "God bless her, but let's keep the refugees overseas." I didn't read some of the worst ones. So getting it right is no easy task when you have such a polarizing issue. What do we do about it? I'm just going to summarize some of the things that we'll probably talk about in our upcoming discussion. And there are experts on this panel that I think can set huge and great examples of how to handle this very tough issue. First, we clearly need to choose our words carefully. Are those fleeing Syria refugees, clandestine immigrants, undercover ISIS terrorists? Our words determine public perception. It means the quality of news reports count. How you frame a story about migration is key. Is it a humanitarian crisis, or a security threat, or just a story about people seeking economic opportunity? To frame it properly, journalists need expertise. They need to be grounded in the issue and also understand the ethics of covering this controversial topic. We also need to make sure that we're giving voice to the refugees themselves. So as I said, we have 6 outstanding panelists who have focused on this issue extensively. Sausan Abuzar, independent journalist and local peace-building expert for Direct Peace in Lebanon, is right here. Paul Dillon, project manager, media officer of the International Organization for Migration. Tom Law, where's Tom? There he is. Director of Campaigns and Communications for the Ethical Journalism Network. Andy Mihudin, did I pronounce it right? Okay. Head of Multimedia for Liputano6.com of Indonesia. And Giles Trendle, Managing Director of Al Jazeera English. And an excellent substitution, Margie Mason, an AP reporter in Asia for the past 10 years, and a Pulitzer Prize winner for a story, an outstanding story on human trafficking. Okay, I'm going to just take the pulse of the panelists right now, and it's a quick question that just deserves a number. How would you rate media coverage of migrants and refugees on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest or the best? Let's start with Tom.
I would say 5.
Well, given the local context in Lebanon, I would say 5 and even 4.50.
4.5. Okay. Can everybody hear Sausan? Can you hear her in the back?
No.
No. Why don't you tell?
So I would say 4.5.
I think it's really difficult to put a value on it because there's some really great reporting and there's some not so great reporting, but I guess if I had to do it, I would probably say around 5 as well.
Okay.
I think in terms of the volume, I would rate it probably an 8. It's a real feature of the times. In terms of the actual content, I have to line up with my friends here and put it somewhere between 4 and 5.
So some media organizations I would say are 9 or 10, some media organizations 1 or 2. So given that, I will say a 5.
I think 5.
Okay. I think we have a consensus that, you know, some people are getting it right and some people are getting it very wrong. And so we're going to focus on a little bit of both. Sausan, let me start with you.
Yeah.
One criticism is that the media rely heavily on stereotypes to tell a very complex, nuanced story. So you're in a hotspot, Lebanon, with lots of refugees. Describe the coverage in your region and tell us how it could be improved.
Well, first, I have to say that Lebanon has the...
Can you hear her back there? Not great.
Okay. So, can you hear me now? Better? Okay. So, Lebanon has the highest per capita refugee population. The Syrian refugees make 1.5 million person. We also have around 450,000 Palestinian refugees, and also the Palestinians who came from Syria, 40,000 Iraqi, and refugees from Sudan and other places. I have to tell you also that during the...
What's the population of Lebanon?
4 million.
4 million, and the refugee population is?
Well, 2 million. So that would be like if the population of Poland and Germany moved to the United States. And that's why we can understand the amount of negative perspective of Syrian refugees and refugees in general in Lebanese society and Lebanese media, but of course this cannot be justified. In terms of the language used, it's like you said, us versus them. Actually, Syrian refugees in Lebanon are being blamed for everything going wrong in the country.
Are they being blamed by the media, or are they being blamed by politicians? Let's talk about the coverage of the issue.
They are being blamed basically by the society, and media reflects the trends in society. Media in Lebanon are owned by businessmen with political affiliations or political parties, and Lebanon is a country of many religious confessions. So each television or newspaper would have, in Lebanon we label it as Christian, as Muslim, and this of course have impact on the quality of reporting. For example, I was saying like Syrian refugees are unjustly blamed for everything going wrong in the country. We had garbage crisis. Even they are blamed for air pollution because we have so many Syrians among us, for higher unemployment. And about the terminology that mainstream media outlets use, for example, some army soldiers were kidnapped by ISIS in the Bekaa Valley on the Syrian borders. So that term army killer was widely used to describe refugees in general, not those extremist fundamentalist Syrians who kidnapped the military man. It's hard for independent Lebanese journalists to have independent platforms for themselves. So you can imagine that it is even harder for Syrian refugees to have their voices heard. Unfortunately, I have worked in a very prominent newspaper. Now I am a freelancer. And when I worked on issues of Syrian refugees, I have to say that I had more freedom reporting for Peace Direct, which is a European organization, than my own newspaper, because I was free. I had a chance to say what I saw when I visited refugee camps, and I was free from the labels of us versus them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll get back to you again. But Andy, tell us about the situation here in Indonesia. Let's bring it here. You and Margie have covered the Rohingya refugees in Aceh. What's the issue here, and why are asylum seekers not getting effective protection in this country?
Okay, I just want to first I want to update about the all Rohingya. So if Indonesia said Rohingya, so I will say Rohingya. All Rohingya refugees from Burma were moved in December from Aceh to Medan. They are awaiting confirmation of their status from the United States Commission for Refugees. There is the main issue is legal problems, because Indonesia is not signatory to the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees. So far in handling of refugees and asylum seekers, they are viewed negatively as illegal or illegal immigrants. So this is really a big problem for me.
Is that reflected in the media coverage, or is that something?
No, this legal problems is reflect the how the government help the immigrants, not the media. But December 31, President Jokowi Dodo released a presidential decree addressing its roughly 14,000 refugees and asylum seekers who were previously overlooked in the country's law. So there is now.
What does that mean? Is this good news? Is this bad news?
This is good news. This
Okay.
is good news. I mean, a better situation than before, because it confirms the definition of refugees convention, and doesn't continue to label asylum seeker as illegal immigrants.
Is the media doing a good job of covering the issue here in Indonesia?
Oh, most of them, yes. But after issue Rohingya become international coverage in 2015, I think the last maybe 6 months, most of media forget about this issue.
So Margie, how do you see the issue from an international media perspective? You're somebody who's covered these refugees.
I think he's right. There's kind of an uptick where the international media will jump onto something. Certainly with the Rohingya here in Indonesia and also in Malaysia and elsewhere, when we had a crisis situation, when boats were at sea and countries were refusing to take these boats and take these Rohingya into their countries, it was, at that point, a crisis, and so everybody was writing about it. But now, things have calmed down. We don't see the jungle camps in Thailand. We don't see the Rohingya kind of coming in boats as they were, and so the media tends to have a very short attention span, and so they move on to the next story and often don't follow up so much on these types of things.
May I add some points? The fact is there are still humanitarian problems, education, health, work. So hundreds of Rohingya children in Indonesia are difficult to get access to adequate education. They are indeed local public school. They are willing to accommodate these children, but these children don't get a diploma, so there is no valid proof that they have completed their education in Indonesia. And also the health, when a woman will give birth, she can be moved from a health center or hospital to another hospital because of the difficult permit handling. Also work, because they are refugees, they are not allowed to work in Indonesia, so they don't have money. Yeah.
In Lebanon as well, Syrian refugees have to pay like $200 per year to get legal residency. And keep in mind that some refugees, they are not allowed to work, but in agriculture, construction, and these are low-wage jobs that Lebanese don't like to do themselves. And to rent a tent in an informal camp, some families have to pay like $50 a month, and they earn only $150. So it's these kind of stories we don't read about, because we don't write about, actually, because we don't give platform and voices for the refugees. When I say we, it is the media, because we reflect the interest of politicians who run the newspapers and TV stations, and what maybe the audience wants, because there is growing racism towards Syrian refugees and refugees in general in Lebanon. And refugees don't have platforms to tell us the story from their side.
Tom, the Ethical Journalism Center has looked at best practices. Why don't you talk a little bit? You've got a new study out, and why don't you talk about what
Sure.
your recommendations?
So we've done 2 studies over the last 2 years. The first in 2015 called Moving Stories, and yesterday the International Centre for Migration Policy Development, ICMPD, published a new report about how media on both sides of the Mediterranean cover migration. The findings relate very closely to what's just been spoken about. So in terms of media often, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through ignorance, getting the terms wrong, conflating refugee, asylum seeker, migrant, and we need to do more within media to make sure that journalists understand the differences, and then we can educate the public about the differences, and to try and destigmatize some of these words. Both reports recommend, wherever possible, migration specialists, like we have some here today, where media can afford them. Migration is such a big topic that it should be a beat in itself, and it should have people that specialize in it. Newsrooms need specific aspects of their code of conduct to refer to migration, and this will include perhaps glossaries about terms to use. And the thing about glossaries is that these are not a list of words that have to be used or are banned. It's words which journalists should be encouraged to consider carefully before using, and to think about alternatives, and to think about really being clear about the meanings.
Can you give some examples?
Well, in terms of language, well, I think that calling a group of people illegals, for example, should definitely be discouraged. Their status might be illegal, or they might have entered illegally, but I think it's dangerous to just refer to a group or of people as illegals, for example. I think that there's a big part to play about how images are used as well. In Italy, the Mare Nostrum campaign, where the Italian Navy was providing rescue operations for people whose boats had capsized in the Mediterranean. This provided great material for media to use about these dramatic images of rescue, but it also portrayed the individuals that were being helped as victims, and it's very much a kind of humanitarian story, and that clouded out some of the angles about the root causes, about why they were moving, about the European Union's strategy in terms of securing its border and closing some borders. So I think it's very important to recognise that. And looking at, for example, the famous image of Aylan Kurdi and how that was used, and people with agendas. You had in the US Senate it being used to show how President Obama's policy wasn't being used correctly. It was used in an event where Aylan Kurdi's father was there, and it becomes so desensitized, this image, that they didn't think that having an image of his dead child on the wall would actually be a really traumatic thing for him to go to. And the choices that media made about which images to use, there are 3 main images of Aylan Kurdi. Him lying face down on the beach, him with the policeman or the figure of authority making notes, and of carrying him. Now, each one tells its own story, and different media, depending on their narrative, chose different ones. If you go for the making the notes, it's very official. This is how the law enforcement is interacting with the migration story. If you have the one where he's holding him tenderly and carrying him, that shows how trying to portray Europe as a welcoming host to people fleeing conflict zones. So I think it's very important to think about these things. There have been some great initiatives, such as the Charter of Rome in Italy, the Charter of Indomini in Greece, where media have come together to say, let's agree on a code of conduct of ethics about how we cover migration. Let's agree on the terms that we should promote using to educate our public. And these should really be encouraged to have them in as many places as possible. Because if it's the Charter of Rome and you're not in Italy, well, it doesn't mean anything to you, despite the great work they've done. So I'd really encourage media, unions of editors and civil society to come together to work to improve how they cover migration in generally. I mean, I'll go on to say that there are some great examples of, there's a project in London called the Refugee Journalism Project, which helps asylum seekers and refugees to get, refugees who have been given status, so they're allowed to work, jobs in media companies in London. It's very hard to navigate the media scene of a new country, but there were really good Syrian journalists and from other places who, through that scheme, they managed to get them in the door at news organisations. It's very important that news organisations take on these refugee journalists who have been forced to cross borders, because they will have insight and they will have knowledge about that country, which reporters sitting in London who don't speak the language and don't have that knowledge of what it feels like and the experience of actually having to flee your home is like. And also cross-border collaboration. So I'd really encourage media, especially in these times when money is so tight, to talk to your colleagues in different countries and find ways that you can work together to share information, to share knowledge, and to do collaborative reporting and collaborative projects. We're currently working with the ILO and Panel South Asia about a project which is a fellowship for journalists in the Middle East and in South Asia, and there'll be South Asian journalists going to parts of the Gulf where the issue of migrant labour is a huge problem and not often reported on very substantially. And so that kind of collaboration really should be encouraged and will produce much more rounded and informed journalism.
It sounds as if there's a great need for a lot more training from what you're saying. And you've mentioned a couple of positive examples, but is there funding out there for training? Or should it be sort of a target of, say, journalism schools where there's a course on this? I mean, do you see any trends where people are actually paying to get journalism this expertise?
There is some funding out there for migration training. I would say the materials are there. I mean, we've produced 2 reports now on migration reporting. We also published another report in January which looks at, among other things, how refugee images are used. And it also included our guidelines that we produced in collaboration with journalists and also with the IOM in order to create simple guidelines. So there are resources out there. So if teachers at journalism schools, if readers, editors and ombudsmen and editors want to, then at the very least we are here as the Ethical Journalism Network to give that support, and there are others who are working on it as well. But it's really a matter of will. I mean, if for other subjects, a lot more effort goes into planning and the ethics of coverage, and I really think that it's a matter of will in terms of the journalism community in general coming together, and the Charter of Rome, the Charter of that was Greek and Italian journalism community and civil society coming together and saying, we have to improve. What can we do to work together to do this? It doesn't have to be money. Goodwill and collaboration with people who are working on similar things and have the values of ethical journalism at their heart, a lot can be done to improve if that collaboration happens.
Paul, you've focused a lot on the language of coverage. It seems to be a logical follow-up to what Tom just said. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure thing. Well, I mean, Tom covered it off so well, I'm not even sure where I'm supposed to go with the question, actually. Look, I'll just start with a quick anecdote. Last September, I escorted a couple of teenage migrants, refugees, to the United States to be resettled into a small town in the plains, town of about 120,000 people, 98% white, very monolithic kind of space. And so these two 16-year-olds who want to be doctors and lawyers and engineers and have all kinds of hopes and dreams, really inspiring young men, they step off the aircraft and they're handed over to the agency that's going to resettle them and take care of them for the next couple of years. Following morning, I'm walking down the street. There's a newspaper box. Increasingly rare to find a newspaper box. I was enchanted, so I opened up the newspaper box and pulled out the local rag. And the front image on it was above the fold was just storm clouds shot through with lightning and this sort of forlorn road heading off to nowhere. In the bottom right corner, there was a guy's face cut off at the nose, just the top of his head to his nose. Very foreboding sort of image. And the headline was, North Dakota's first refugee family arrives from Syria. And I thought to myself, I went and had my coffee and had my breakfast, and I kept going back to this image and thinking about how powerful and how negative this image was for the ordinary person walking down the street, stopping at the paper box in a small town in North Dakota. And it really got me thinking about language and the way that these sorts of issues are presented. I managed to suppress my desire to go to the newspaper office, knock on the door, and sit down and have a cup of coffee with the managing editor and ask him what the thought processes were behind that. But I think these thought processes are being repeated time and time and time again all over the world. Tom and others have covered off some of the language that we read and we hear. They didn't mention floods and hordes and mobs, the criminals, the rapists, the jihadis, all these sort of these negative signs that are being hung around. Bad hombres that are being hung around people's necks before they're even given a chance to sort of explain themselves. So there's that kind of language, which is the responsibility of editors and journalists and media institutions that really need to find a way to tell the story in a different way. And it's very difficult. Market forces are at play. They're playing to a certain constituency, and perhaps maybe a constituency that no amount of media training and awareness raising and campaigning is ever truly going to affect. You have your true believers set in their ways. And for that reason, for those of us who see the positive, who see the acceptance of refugees into our countries as being a net positive, who see migration as being a net positive, we have very few arrows, as it were, in our quiver. We have very few things that on the development aid side of things and within the journalism community that we can use. And one of the things that we can use is accuracy in the language that we use to describe people. There are divergent opinions on this. I imagine we're going to hear some of them. But, refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, these are technical terms. A refugee is a technical term for somebody. The push and pull factors, the things that are going on globally now, unparalleled really since the Second World War, the drivers are manifold. Not everybody is fleeing war in Syria. There are heaped, famine, disease, labor, a huge draw on migration, on migrants. People simply looking for better economic activities. I think it's really important for us on the development side, and working maybe with people like Tom and his organization and others, to help journalists to better understand what the nuances are in that nomenclature. Because it's really important to call a spade, if you like.
Really great points. The next two people who are going to talk are basically journalists who have got it right. And I'll start with Margie, because she won the Pulitzer as part of a team that identified people who were human trafficked for basically slave labor. And one of the key points here is it wasn't just telling the story of the slave labor, but it was also telling the story of where the goods ended up. And that had tremendous impact. So I will let her talk about that story and why it was so impactful?
Well, actually, that story kind of, it came from another story. I was working with a colleague, Robin McDowell. She was based in Myanmar at the time, and she and I were working on a Rohingya story, looking at children who were fleeing Rakhine State alone. And a little girl who was 10 years old ended up here in Indonesia. And so we were at the IOM talking to our friends there and trying to get some information about Rohingya and some data. And when I was there, I was told, you know, maybe you want to look at these migrant fishermen who are coming from different places in Southeast Asia and kind of ending up abandoned or stuck here in Indonesia. And I knew about this. I've been in the region for a long time. I think those of us who have covered any issues involving trafficking know that there's been a long-standing problem with men being trafficked from places like Myanmar and Cambodia, Thailand and Laos onto fishing boats and getting stuck. And so I looked at the data and I went back and I called Robin and I said, okay, maybe we want to look at this. It's an open secret. We know it exists. And so we said, okay, let's take a look. But we need to do two things. And they were very ambitious. One, we wanted to do something that other journalists had not really done. And that was, we wanted to try to find men who were captive, who were being held somewhere against their will. And we also, from the very beginning, were very mindful and clear that if we found these men, we wanted to trace their fish and their seafood back to Europe and back to the US. And we wanted to be very meticulous and very specific, and we wanted to name names because we felt like this is the only way to really put pressure on the industry and to really shine a light on this problem that, again, had been occurring for decades. And so this was 2014, I guess. We spent about almost a year, digging and clawing and interviewing everybody we could find and really just doing what journalists do. And we were doing that on top of our day jobs. So we were covering, whatever plane crashes and earthquakes or whatever else was happening in our countries and doing this on the side. And eventually we kind of heard that there was this island in a very, very remote corner of eastern Indonesia called Benjina. And we heard that there might be some guys there, quite a few guys. And so we went there and checked it out, and what we found was really astounding. We found men locked in cages, in a cage. We found a graveyard filled with bodies, and the markers were they weren't their names, they weren't their nationalities. Even in death, they were not given the dignity of their own nationalities or names. We found men on boats literally crying and pleading to us over the side of their trawlers and saying, please help us, take us home. Men were running after, and this was Robin McDowell and Esther Tucson were the two on Benjina at the time, but they were men running after them, stuffing pictures of themselves and little scraps of paper into their hands and saying, please, please, go back to Myanmar and find my parents and tell them that I am alive and I am in Indonesia and I cannot come home to them. These men were forced to work 22-hour days, sometimes 24-hour days. They were beaten with iron rods. They were beaten with stingray tails. They were locked up simply for asking to go home. They were not paid either. These were Thai boats. These were that had come to Indonesia. These men had all come from very poor places in the region, and they were looking for opportunity They were poor, and they had been told that there were jobs in Thailand. In some cases, they were tricked. In other cases, they were drugged and put onto boats, and they simply woke up at sea with no way to escape these floating prisons. So we got the story, and we could have just published when we found this island. It was incredibly dramatic, but we, and AP was very much behind this as well. All of us, Martha Mendoza in California was working with us as well, and we all said, no, we want to trace this seafood. Robin and Esther had seen the seafood being put onto a ship. We used satellites, we tracked it, we went to Thailand, we followed it for 4 nights, and watched where it was being delivered. And then Martha dug in and started building databases and started tracking exactly where that seafood was going. And it went everywhere, to the supply chains of Walmart, Whole Foods, Albertsons, Kroger, to the pet food Fancy Feast, Imes, Meow Mix. We found it just basically going everywhere. And when we published, we named names, and afterward, it was an incredible impact. Within, I think, a little more than a week, the Indonesian fishery minister here, Ibu Susi, she was very upset, and they launched a task force to go and check it out to see if what we had reported was true. And when they got there, they found the situation was indeed as serious as we had reported, and they launched a rescue right then and there. And over the course of 2015, there were more than 2,000 men across in various islands that were freed as a result, in part, from our reporting. So I think the lesson is that you can, we can have an impact. It's good to have an ambitious project and to follow through with the supply chain. The supply chain, I think, is extremely important.
That was an amazing story. It kind of chokes me up just to listen to it again. But the supply chain, did the big companies start looking into their supply chain and do anything about correcting? I mean, obviously they're not going to keep buying from those people, but was there anything launched into really examining where the food comes from?
Yeah, there was a lot of work that was done on this. Audits were done. I think a lot of the companies really tried to put pressure on the Thai companies and also the Thai government. I mean, this is a $7 billion industry. Now, I would like to sit here and say today that the problem has been solved and that this no longer happens, but that is not true. It is still happening every day. This is something that's been going on for generations. But at least now, no one can say that they don't know. No one can plead ignorance. Everybody knows. The cat is literally out of the bag. So I think for us, it was just really important to shine this light. And there had been other work, other journalists had done work on this as well. And I think now there's a body of work, and no one can ignore it. And there's a lot of money being spent now, I think, and a lot of time being spent trying to focus on this problem.
If I could just add on to that, oftentimes in the media, we pour a lot of time and energy into a particular story, and it hits the wall, and it gets a bit of traction, and it gets some coverage, and then a couple of months later, everybody just goes back to sleep, and you wonder to yourself, whether have we affected change? What has actually changed? Well, this is one of the cases where things did change. I can't speak to the supply chain issue, though I understand that some of the larger international conglomerates are taking a much closer view of their supply chain issues and putting pressure on suppliers. But domestically here in Indonesia, Margie mentioned the creation of Task Force 115, which is a significant step in the right direction in a very complex sector, which in the Indonesian context, like all extraction-based industries, indeed not just in Indonesia but elsewhere, produces a huge amount of wealth. a large portion of which ends up in the pockets not of workers and communities, but in the pockets of other actors. And a second thing that came down from their investigation, beyond the return of these 2,000 enslaved fishermen, was an attempt by the government here to create and now to enforce compliance of a human rights audit for any vessel operating in Indonesian waters. Now, there's two sides to this story. First of all, it's very important. Indonesia doesn't have a great fleet of ships. It's not like Korea or Taiwan where they're sailing the oceans capturing fish. A lot of it's done by rebranded foreign vessels in Indonesian waters. But there's a movement now firmly afoot with legislative support to actually force vessels and their owners to comply with an audit, to ensure that workers are properly documented, that they're living in relatively humane conditions, that they are being paid, that they are allowed to have contact with their families, these types of things. So these are really positive steps that the government has taken as a direct consequence of the series of stories that AP put together and a body of work that was done before AP took the big bite out of it back in 2015.
Yes, this is a number 10 on that scale of 1 to 10, or maybe 12. Another example of excellent coverage has been by Al Jazeera English. Why don't you talk a little bit about why your coverage has been effective and distinctive?
Okay.
Sure.
Just to add one example of names. Calais jungle. So in the north of France, there's a place called Calais, and it's where many refugees go when they go through Europe to try and get into Britain. And the refugee camp became known, certainly in some British media, as the Calais jungle. Now, what do you think of when you hear the word jungle? You think of dangerous wild animals who are threatening you and are going to come and attack you. And it's just another example, of how language is used. Remember, language can be used for genocide. Hitler, of course, used language. He called the Jews serpents and snakes. In Rwanda, the Hutus called the Tutsis cockroaches. And all this vocabulary was a precursor to genocide. Now, we hope it's not going to go that far in places like Europe or anywhere else, but the danger of language is very real. So in Al Jazeera, let me give you two examples of how we cover this story. Firstly, a language issue. In the summer of 2015, when the overwhelming number of refugees to Europe were coming from Syria. Of course, there were some from Eritrea, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, but the overwhelming majority were coming from Syria. And we made a conscious decision to call them refugees, not migrants. And we put that out there. We wrote an opinion piece in the summer of 2015. We said, we are going to call these people refugees. And there's a very important difference politically, legally, and in the way that you describe them. Refugees are people who are fleeing war. You give them a certain humanity because it's the sort of thing we would all do in a war situation. Migrants tend to be seen by certain countries, certain people as a nuisance, as a drain on economic resources, as threatening the social fabric of society. So there's an important difference. And there's an important difference legally between migrant and refugee. So we made this because we felt that the word migrant was dehumanizing and distancing who these people were. So that's the first example. The second example I want to give is we do many different types of news and programs shows. We do many different types of documentaries. We have talk shows. We have historical documentaries. We have investigative documentaries. But there's one particular documentary strand which talks to the experience of people. It's called Witness. It's a half-hour documentary strand. It's every week. So it goes to the point that's been made about the attention span going away. But this is a weekly documentary show. And it's a observational documentary, and what that means, it's an experiential documentary. What that means is it's focused on characters. And it's very important. It's not, there's no presenter, there's no reporter. The people at the center of the story are the people telling their own story. And that's really important. People need to own their own story. Of course, this is one particular documentary. It's not all in our coverage. We have a whole range of coverage. But this is a weekly documentary strand that really helps us put these sorts of human stories. And we every week we show different types of stories, but many of them focus on the refugee situation. So we have stories that the characters are at the center of their story, and they own their own story. And what that means is that they have agency over their own story. They narrate their own story. There's no Farangi narrator or foreign narrator. It's narrated by the characters themselves, and that's really important. And the other point is it shows that they are human beings. They're not just, and they're not always victims. They're not always passive, objectified victims. Many of the stories, of course, they have suffered and they continue to suffer, but there's a humanity. They're human beings, and this comes through in many of the stories that we show. And as an example, we did a story, one of the films was called Refugees Got Talent. Of course, you know Asia's Got Talent. And this was about Syrian refugees in a camp in Greece. What they did, they decided to create their own talent show within the camp, and they put out a call to all the people in that camp, and they ran a talent show. Singers, dancers, poets, comedians. And in the course of the film, we see the group of people who were running this talent show. And some of the refugees in the camp said, this is bad, this is haram, we shouldn't be making light of our situation. And we showed this in the film. But the majority of the refugees in the camp, they kind of did a straw poll. The majority of the refugees in the camp said, no, go ahead, we want to do this. So they did the competition. One of the guys won. And again, it shows that in the depth of adversity and misery, there is a humanity that we mustn't forget. They are not just victims. That's very important to point out.
And one of the criticisms when I was preparing for this panel was that are we giving voice to the voiceless? And I think you just heard two really good examples of the voiceless having a voice, and good examples for other people to follow. Salsan, you wanted to add to that thought, right?
Yeah, about the use of terms. In Arabic, it is easily manipulated and confusing and confused. For example, refugees in Lebanon are being officially called internally displaced, nazih. Nazih is internally displaced, whereas refugee is lajih. Recently, in the new Lebanese cabinet, there was a new ministry for internally displaced issues. We don't have internally displaced, so it was called in Arabic Wizara لشؤون النازحين, not لاجئين. This tells us a lot about the official policies toward the refugees, as Lebanon did not sign the Refugee Convention and its protocol. So in this context, like I said, media reflects the whole context. But I believe this should be changed and can be changed by simply giving refugees who are not internally displaced voices and platforms to make their voices heard. There have been small examples of organizations giving children refugees still cameras to portray their daily lives in the camps, in their schools, which are prefabricated containers. And the outcome was was published in an exhibition and in a book, and the proceedings went to help these refugees. So in my opinion, in the local context of my country, and on the official level, not only in the media, we should stop, government should stop calling Syrian refugees and Palestinian refugees internally displaced, because they are not, they are refugees.
Tom, you wanted to add to that?
Yes, just to say that we've been working with the American University in Cairo over the last year to produce a glossary about Egyptian media on hate speech, and much of that includes hate speech against migrants and refugees, and it's going to be launched next week in Cairo. So if you are interested in that, then please do look out for it. I think it's very important that, especially as today is World Press Freedom Day, that we recognize that coverage of migration, like any other topic that journalists cover, is only as good as the environment in which journalists are able to work. And by that, I don't just mean their contracts and how stable their employment is, or that's very important, but the pressure that's put on by governments and other actors in society which discourage journalists from actually covering the issue in a comprehensive, pluralistic way. For example, the report published yesterday with the International Centre for Migration and Policy Development found that in North Africa, journalists who want to cover the humanitarian side of the story, not just the security side of the story, and when the narrative moves away from people who are passing through, so it's no problem for us, to, oh, actually, these people might be staying here for a while, they're not just on their way to Europe, they're not on their way to the next country. When that narrative starts to change, then we see a lot of pressure on journalists to self-censor. And I think that it's very important that today of all days we recognize that we have to call for governments and for other people in society who put undue pressure on journalists, that journalism has to be given the space to do its job properly. And I think that's something we can all get behind, and I hope that as part of the work that we're doing, we can raise awareness about this issue more widely, because it is, self-censorship around the issue of migration is a huge problem in many parts of the world.
I'd like to add to that for a second. You know, it's interesting. When I walked away from journalism in 2005, at that time nobody even considered the notion of covering migration as a beat. And now we have standalone agencies that are doing nothing but covering migration and the related topics as a beat. You have the beginnings of a professional class of journalists who are focusing on these issues, and to me that's very it's a great turn of events. Not just agencies, but the individuals within the agencies who are becoming highly specialized to cover, you know, a massive, a global topic with all kinds of repercussions and implications. It is something that I would love to see happen in Indonesia. There are 2.5 million Indonesians working overseas in Malaysia, only half of whom are actually registered. The numbers are very opaque, but those are roughly accurate. There are hundreds of thousands working elsewhere in the world, some of them legally registered and some of them heading out on their own, their movements facilitated, who are remitting something like $10 billion a year. Pardon me, I think the numbers are bigger than that. I'm an old-timers moment here. Remitting significant monies back to Indonesia. It would be great to see that kind of thing happening within the Indonesian journalism community. And one final point on local journalism. Can we please agree to stop using the term immigrant gelap? Okay? Pengungsi is refugee. Pencari suaka is asylum seeker. Immigrant gelap, which literally means dark immigrant or shadowy migrant or some combination of that, immediately puts people on the back foot. Your readers are all automatically taking a negative perspective of who that person is and what their story is. So let's agree maybe on the Indonesian end of things to try and change the type of conversation we're having here. Thank you.
I wanted to talk a little bit about what Tom just said, too, which is we often talk about protection of journalists, but there's also protection of information and good stories. And sometimes a story may seem to fizzle out because the editors or whatever don't want to do it anymore, but there's an important story to be done here. And what we're seeing now with the rise of these investigative journalism groups all around the world who participated in something like the Panama Papers project, they're finding ways to get the information out if they can't do it themselves. So it's also interesting for journalists to know if you can't do it, don't let the story die. There's some way to find people to get the story out that will dare to do it. And they're not all Western journalists. They could be, you know, your local investigative journalism group.
Can I just add quickly to Paul's point?
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Just to add, I had a meeting about this time last year with the Press Council here in Indonesia about migration reporting. So I think that in terms of the self-regulatory side of things, I think that the Press Council here will be very open to having that debate, and perhaps it's something we can talk to them about because they're co-organisers of this conference. I'm sure they'd be interested in having a conversation about what role they can play and in getting these terms onto their codes and standards which they're judging and they're regulating media hereby.
And the last question I wanted to ask, and then I'll open it up to the audience, is on a subject that's been brought up in other areas, which is fake news. But there seems to be an awful lot of fake news about refugees, and designed in part to stir up those kind of hostile feelings, or designed to destabilize certain governments who may be more embracing towards refugees. So I want to ask, what recommendations do you have for journalists when it comes to stories like seeing stories like that? How do you attack it? Who wants to take that one?
I can have a go. If I just spoke, I'll try and be very brief. I think that it's a dilemma, because the more that media expose fake news, the more we're drawing attention to it. So it's a very complicated thing to engage with. I've noticed that a good thing that BuzzFeed have been doing recently, this is related to breaking news, is they'll have a page where they will have their story, their fact-checked, verified story, and they'll have another page where they'll put all the stuff they've debunked. So they're not wasting that reporting time. So they've found out this stuff's rubbish, but they're putting it on a page so everyone else can see what's rubbish and be made aware of it. So that's one thing that can be done. I think that in terms of what's shared on social media, memes are a huge way of communicating, which I don't think we really understand their impact properly, but they're so easily shared and the message is so easily communicated. It goes back to media literacy about helping people to think twice before they hit that share button. Think about what is the intention behind the person who's sharing this. On the surface, it might be, look like something that, I can't believe this has been held from us for all this time. We really must encourage people to think about what they share online and be more self-critical about what they see and how fast they share things. I think the speed is really important with this, because fake news, if nobody shared it, it wouldn't go anywhere. So we have to make sure that in terms of what our own behaviour online to encourage that reflection before sharing things.
Well, I'm just going to interject one thing and I'll send it. But we had libel lawyers come in so that we could understand what retweeting means, because we didn't know. If somebody tweets something that's libelous and you retweet it in the U.S. with our First Amendment, you are also committing libel, just so that you know. So thinking twice about what you retweet has consequences. Yeah, let me turn it over to you.
Yeah. Just to define what fake news is, look, I read a really wonderful definition. Actually, it was written by one of Tom's colleagues from the ethical journalism. And I just felt it was a really nice definition, so I'll read it to you. Fake news is information deliberately fabricated and published with the intention to deceive and mislead others into believing falsehoods or doubting verifiable facts. I thought that was beautifully encapsulated the definition of fake news, because it's one of the, again, it's one of those terms that we always use, and it's becoming almost in danger of becoming meaningless. Because what is it? I think one of the solutions to fake news is editorial integrity, editorial quality. I'm a bit of an optimist. I'm not a pessimist when it comes to the media and I'm excited by all the change that's happening in the media, the digital revolution. But I do believe there's a lot of fake news. But I'm a great believer in editorial quality will come out and will rise to the top. And I think that's going to make the difference. It might take a bit of time. There's a lot of new media outlets starting, but in the end, accuracy, objectivity, balance, fairness, these are all qualities that will, I hope, come to the top.
I brought it up mainly in particular because there are so many refugee stories that are exploited this way I think for very deliberate reasons. Did you want to add something, Andy?
Yeah, I don't know what's happened in in United States, but in Indonesia, I see that the fake news is like a bullet. It's real fast. Everybody share it in Facebook. I found so many pictures about Rohingya in fake news of Rohingya in Facebook, and everybody share it also in the WhatsApp group. So it's ironical because it's very dangerous for the refugees. One thing is very important that mainstream media should. I think they have like a team to check every photo videos before they share it. I think that's
running the risk of sounding promotional. ICFJ, the International Center for Journalists, is running a contest now called Truth Buzz, where we're looking for ways, technologies, platforms, to get the truth to travel as quickly as lies. And it's open to anyone. We're hoping that once we get some great ideas, we'll share it widely with the entire journalism community. But if you have a good idea, please submit it. I'm going to open the questions up. We had a great group. Yes, we have a lot of questions here.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good evening. My name is Santa Monica. I'm a student from Yogyakarta. Okay. I would like to address my questions to the speakers. First, what alternatives that might be possible done by the journalists around the world to encourage the struggle of women and children in borderland and war areas in terms of fight for their rights? As we know, they are marginalized and minority. Of course, they are victims in patriarchal society. And then
Is there a media question in that, or a coverage question? Are you asking how to cover women and children? Because these are
media coverage.
How to improve media
alternatives that might be possible done by the journalists in media in any other in so many media. Okay, and then how do the journalists raise the awareness about it? And then my third question, we know that wars are decided by the government and politicians. So do you raise awareness to public about that through journalism works? Thank you.
Okay.
I think on the women and children issue, that's something that I have spent a large part of my career covering, women and children and poverty. My background is in medical reporting, and so often those women and children intersect with health coverage. And I have tried over the years working at AP, which is a huge platform, to shine a light on issues and to give voice to the voiceless. And often women and children in a lot of places are kind of at the bottom rung on the ladder, and they're forgotten and they're invisible. So, you know, I, over the years, have spent a lot of time trying to encourage other journalists, especially young journalists. You know, you don't have to oftentimes go for the most glamorous stories. Try to look for stories in places where no one else is looking, and try to, again, you know, let people who are silent have a voice. And I think that, you know, in doing that, you shine a light on problems that a lot of people, they don't even know exists.
Yeah, we actively look for women characters. We had a documentary series, actually, check it out, called Women Make Change. And it was, the idea is that the economic empowerment of women will be great for the country and a real driver of change for society. So on the other side of the, on the other end of the extreme is you should look at the women fighters in Kurdistan. You don't want to get on the wrong side of them. They're not the humble, submissive women that, you know, the stereotype of that. They are tough cookies, and we've done stories on them as well. So we find the full spectrum of stories to cover women's issues, which are very important for us.
All right, we have a question here in the front row.
Thank you. My name is Azar Asrat. I am coming from a country where 9th of each citizen is refugee or IDP, Azerbaijan, I mean. I heard the case of Al Jazeera, and that was a very good example, and I appreciate your case, but I would like to remind and would like to ask someone's comment on the situation in two cases. Probably everybody knows and remembers while the Hungarian journalist kicked off Syrian refugee while just they tried to escape. And I would like to get some comments on this. And second one is that on the eve of New Year, most German newspapers just copied a news that refugees are sexually harassing every woman everywhere in Germany. So nobody asked apology for that fake news. Thank you.
Yeah, who wants to address that issue? And that was a particularly egregious story.
Yeah, you're talking about the Hungarian journalist. There was a Syrian refugee running across a field, and a Hungarian journalist sticked her foot out and tripped up the refugee. Yeah, it was horrendous. We covered that. We covered it even in the sense of what the hell are media doing? If you have journalists doing that, my God, what about others who are feeding off that sort of thing? There seemed to be a happy ending to that story, I seem, because the refugee himself and his son went, I think, was it to Spain, and I think they met Cristiano Ronaldo. But anyway, it was a horrendous story, and it was evidence of what we're talking about earlier. That some media, this would be the media on the 1 scale or the -1. So it's very worrying that some media are doing that.
Just a quick comment on that. So Hungary and Germany were actually two of the countries covered in the report released yesterday, and both of those issues are covered in that. So I strongly recommend you go and find it online. You'll find much more detail than we can give in this short time we have today.
Well, I have a story to share with you about a journalist reporting about an incident that happened recently in Lebanon with a racist language, and it didn't have a happy ending. There was a dispute between a guy and a street vendor who sells Nescafe. The guy wanted a Nescafe, so the vendor asked him, how would you like your Nescafe? I mean, there are not many ways of making a Nescafe. And then there was a dispute, and the guy shooted the vendor of Nescafe and a passerby. And, well, it's a horrible crime. But a local reporter for a TV station with, I have to say it, sorry, with Christian background, thus not very welcoming of Syrian refugees. She went to the Bekaa, where the incident happened on Syrian borders, and she felt it was okay to say on air live that the victim had a non-Lebanese accent, meaning the poor guy was a Syrian refugee, as if it is okay to kill him after a simple dispute about a silly Nescafe cup because he had a non-Lebanese accent. And at the headquarters of the TV station, after outrages and comments on social media, no one felt like she needs to be punished. I'm not saying fired, but punished. And no one felt they needed to apologize for the language she used. So unfortunately, there are no happy endings for everyone. And some journalists do make mistakes, and no one, it goes on.
Yeah. There's one question back here. And over here, next.
I'm Jaldeep Katwala from Foyo Media Institute in Bangkok. 2 points. First of all, you talked about training of journalists, but isn't there a point behind that, which is in the selection of journalists in the first place? That if you come from one particular background, you may come from a privileged section of society, whether that's in the north or the south, you find it hard to empathize or sympathize with refugees and refugee issues. And the other point is that all the great 10 stories that are out there, it's people like us that tend to watch them, and the people that really need to watch them are the ones who appreciate the 1 stories and the 2 stories.
Yes. Anybody want to react to that?
I think unconscious bias is a very big problem when it comes to migration coverage and diversity in general. Just one point about training of journalists. I think it's very important that when we're planning training around any issue, that we do it engaging with the editors of the organisation. Like, we've all been in situations, I'm sure, we've either been in a training or been giving a training, and either you're giving a, recently I was in Macedonia and we were doing something on public interest journalism, and the journalist said, "Oh, this is all great, Tom, but we can't use half of this in our newsroom. There's no way they'll allow us to cover it in this way." So when we're planning media development activities, it has to be in collaboration with the owners of the organisations, the chief editors, so that whatever we're teaching journalists and with resources and new things, they'll actually get used. And so that dialogue with editors and owners, as well as just training, has to be done as a joined-up effort. Otherwise, its impact just won't be big enough. And there are tools that I encourage journalists to take about self-conscious bias to try and make yourself realise the biases that you may have, even though I think of myself as a very enlightened, progressive person. I know I have my prejudices and I have blind spots. So we all have to recognise that, especially journalists who often, despite the issues of the industry in terms of finance, are often, without meaning to kind of channel Donald Trump in any way, the kind of metropolitan elite in some regard. There is some truth to that, and it goes back to kind of diversity of newsrooms and making sure that, I said earlier about refugee journalists, but also journalists from different backgrounds, to ensure that you have those perspectives. One more thing quickly about internal governance. I think it's very important that not just we try and strengthen self-regulation for media, but also internal governance within media itself, in terms of codes of conduct, in terms of corrections, that can be in terms of migration stories or anything else. And the more we can do that, the more we can make media accountable to our audiences, the more they'll trust us, and the more that we will stand out in the marketplace, and people will come to read good journalism and watch good journalism, rather than not distinguish between what's in their newsfeed, but between quality content, verified professional content, and all the other kinds of news that's out there. So we really have to make an effort as an industry to make ourselves more accountable, admit we make mistakes, in order for us to be able to get these messages across to the people which you're talking about, and so that we're not just talking to ourselves.
Yes, Julie.
Hi, just a quick comment. I think it starts earlier than training journalists. I think it starts in journalism education context, perhaps at universities. And putting on my journalism educator hat for a moment, I just wanted to share with you an example from Australia from 2011, a project I ran with the ABC involving journalism students with a clear objective to teach how to encourage self-representation, which is what you're talking about before, of refugees and asylum seekers, challenging misrepresentation of those terms. And we produced journalism that was designed to engage audiences in a way that shifted public opinion based on facts. So I've tweeted a link to what we learned from that, which was published by Media Shift. It might be useful, and it's also been published in a collection of guides to training by UNESCO a couple of years ago.
That sounds like a great resource. Yes, we have somebody right here in the front row. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Beni Bukhari. I'm from Indonesia. Yes. I think listening to this from the speakers are very interesting. I do think that journalists actually are facing challenges from different aspects, from the government, from authoritarian government, from the public, but also from the industry. As I'm sitting here, I listened that the panelists were all saying that it's not right to keep the story quiet. But how do you have any recommendation to get it out? Because many times or often the media industry has its own agenda. Thank you.
Well, I did mention that there are independent investigative groups now that will take the story and share it. I'm sure there might be a way to talk to somebody like Margie, who also might love the idea and run with it. You know, the censorship or the self-censorship thing is a serious problem, and no one's diminishing that. But I think there are more ways now to protect information from dying. But does anybody else have any other suggestions?
Yeah, we will always be open to a story. I mean, any plight of anyone, we are open to it. We wouldn't censor it. I mean, even as Al Jazeera, we do stories on migrant laborers in Qatar. You know, we will do stories where there is a need, wherever it takes us.
I think that sometimes also if you can find a partner or a cross-border partner, sometimes there's less fear about publishing it because there's another partner in there with you. We found that in several cases. So it might be a good idea to collaborate and see if that will help move the needle in your newsroom.
I think that there are so many new ways of storytelling that we have available to us, and sometimes journalism is not always the best way to get across something, especially when you're not talking to someone who's have the same opinion of you about migration and refugees. So films and art can be a really good way, and to use them to raise awareness. In my previous role before working with the EJN, I was working for a children's rights organisation in Nepal, raising awareness about child trafficking. Very sensitive subject. But they partnered with a film made about it, which was very well done, and it really got across, the horror of trafficking, but it really would reach people who would not normally engage in the issue. So I think wherever possible, we should look to see outside of journalism what other kinds of media we have to communicate this story.
Are there other questions? Right here, and then here.
My name is Mitra and I'm from UNHCR Indonesia. I have a question in the past there are some coverage about refugees that reveals the identity of the refugees, like their real names and sometimes even the registration number with UNHCR Indonesia and close-up photos. Now I would like to ask the panelists about your opinion about this matter from an ethical journalism point of view. And is there any guidelines agreed by the media in terms of revealing refugees' identity, because sometimes, often they have protection needs?
Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
This is a really tricky issue because as journalists we all want to identify and have a name and a face to our stories. But when you're dealing with people who are at risk, whether they be refugees or migrant workers or trafficked women or children, you have to be careful with this. And I can speak from my own reporting. When we were working on the Seafood from Slaves series, this was something that we spent a lot of time talking about. We were very much aware that the men that we were, we had video and photos, and we had the story, of course, of these men, and they were still on the island. And if we published, what might happen to them. And this was a huge issue that went up to high levels in the AP. And at the end of the day, we actually made a decision to do something that most journalists don't do, and that is we decided to go to the IOM and ask them to help us and see if we couldn't get the guys that were actually identified in our reporting away from this island. And they worked with us, and the Indonesian Marine Police got involved, and this was some might say that we crossed a line, that we involved ourselves, but at the end of the day, we were not going to publish anything with their faces or their names unless we knew they were safe. And we had explosive video of a man locked in a cage, which I think we all wanted desperately to use because it was incredibly powerful to show how extreme this was. So this was what we did in this situation, and I think again there were a lot of discussions at very high levels, and we all felt strongly that we won't do anything to put anyone's life at risk.
I think that's very commendable, the choice that you made in that situation. I think it's very important to realize that one of the values of journalism is shared humanity with the people that you're dealing with and the sources that you have. So you can't look at it completely from, I have to get this story out. You have to think about the vulnerable people who you might endanger and then make choices according to that. In terms of guidelines, we published some guidelines recently about how to handle sources in terms of leak of information, but also of vulnerable people. So I'd recommend that you might want to refer to that.
All right, and our final question is right here, right? Did you have one? Yes.
Thank you. Our colleague from Azerbaijan mentioned two cases, and some of you responded to the Hungarian case of the kicking journalist. The other case, you didn't mention the German raping refugees case, as it's mentioned in the media in my country, Denmark. Have any of you had the chance to dig into what's up and down in that story? And to my knowledge, it contains both news and fake news.
Anybody?
Yeah, I mean, we have a weekly show called Listening Post, which looks at media coverage, which analyzes media coverage, and we did something on the store in Cologne, and yes, there was a lot of hysteria and overreaction, but there were, you're right, there were some elements that were substantiated in some way, but it was a case of, a lot of it was overreaction, I think.
Well, there are a lot of rumors, and I don't want to repeat them because that would be bad journalism, so I'll stay away from that. One more. Go ahead, but make it a quick one, please.
Thank you. It's Step Fasen.
I can't answer this question because Step works with my company.
It's
so.
not your question. I'm Step Fasen for Al Jazeera. I just want to highlight again what you mentioned before, combining forces. What happened after AP broke the story in Benjina about the sea slaves? We actually, Al Jazeera and AP, went together to Benjina for the rescue of all these sea slaves, and just being present there with a camera and AP with a crew, we were basically the only two media there. The sea slaves basically were rescued because they couldn't just be detained any longer in front of all these media. So I think what I want to also make a call for more media to join forces, especially with limited means these days, and these things really have a good result, I think.
Yeah. Just look at the Panama Papers project.
One second on that.
Okay.
Thanks, Step, and I appreciate your comments on that. I mean, look, I'm a project manager and a media officer with an international organization with representation in like 140 countries. We work with journalists daily. The good thing is within the organization I work with is that we're there for background. We're there to give you context. We're not there to sell you stories. So on issues of migration, whether it's here or in Azerbaijan or in Greece or in Central America, it's a relatively good stopping point to pick up the phone and call IOM, because where in the missions it'll talk to you, you'll get a pretty good landscape around what's going on.
Well, I thought the panelists here were absolutely superb, and I'd like to thank you very much for a wonderful discussion. Thank you.